This is the Bottom Shot Podcast.
Pulvereri is up high. They come out of turn number 4. Stutter between the turns. The fans come to their feet.
It is Ted Christopher still in command. Keith Rocco right there on his back bumper.
Bringing Stafford Motor Speedway's past and present together.
They are side by side running for the finish line. It's a photo finish.
Deep into turn number 3. He goes in deeper than most. Christopher is in trouble. It is Keith Rocco to slingshot to the bottom, and he'll take down the win.
A Stafford Motor Speedway production where we will hear from the personalities from the past and present that found success on the legendary half-mile oval.
The scoreboard shows goose eggs as they wait. It's Pulvereri. He wins it by inches over Richie Evans in the Spring Sizzler.
Unbelievable chain of events.
Now, here are your hosts, Paul Arute and Kyle Rickey. The Bottom Shot Podcast is on the road again here from the Stafford Motor Speedway as we go to northern New England. Paul Arute to the Northeast Museum here on the property of the New Hampshire Motor Speedway.
And we have a treat this morning. We have Lew Boyd, one of the founding members of the Spring Sizzler, which goes into its 50th season. Lew, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. And that 50-year number sure is a scary one. I'll tell you that it feels like yesterday because it was kind of a rainy day, and we didn't really have a rain date, and we sure had no money. So if it had rained out, we still would have been washing dishes.
Wow.
And I keep thinking about that.
Wow, so even 50 years down the road, he remembers the weather. There was no rain date. I mean, I hope the 50th in the spring is a beautiful sunny day. That's all I can say.
You can count on it.
So, Lew, kind of take us all the way back to when you were a kid. When did you first get exposed to the sport? When did you first fall in love?
Well, it was kind of a cataclysmic event, actually. I was born in Amsterdam, New York, which is down the street from Fonda Speedway. And when I was knee-high to a hubcap, I got tuberculosis. And they sent me up to a sanatorium up in the mountains, and I finally came back home but had to learn to walk again and the whole thing. And there was a kindly neighbor who took sympathy on me and took me for a ride one Saturday night. And he made the unforgivable mistake of driving me by Fonda Speedway. And it was instant, and the psychological term for it is imprinting. And I smelled those smells, saw those colors, saw all the action, heard the noise, and that was it, just like a duck falling in love with the bumper of a Volkswagen. And so I really got into racing, and never mind being a professional baseball player, I wanted to be a racer. And the only problem is that my dad was a doctor, and he was the emergency room doctor at St. Mary's Hospital, which had a paved road right from Fonda every Saturday night. And he made sure that I understood that if I ever mentioned the word racing again in our household, I would be excommunicated.
Wow.
So it was difficult for me to get going. Eventually we moved to Boston, and there were some little tracks nearby like Norwood and Westboro and some of those. And so quite by secret, I got myself a B car and started in that while going to high school and then college. And it was difficult because, given my father's opinion of things, I didn't have a lot of automotive training, and I didn't know the difference in a spark plug from a ball joint. So it was tough for me on the track to get a car that would even run. And I knew the only way that I could really distinguish myself was to go into the turn harder than anyone else. So I got started, and I flipped the first 3 nights in a row.
Whoa.
And at that point, something good happened. And that was, there was a wonderful man that we'll talk about later, I'm sure, in this podcast, named Bill Welch, who was the announcer. And he came down to see who this idiot was who was flipping all the time. And we became friends instantly. And in a way, he became my altar dad and managed to calm me down a little bit, I guess. And so over time, I began to get some rides and then got myself a little hobby car and finally started going modified racing, which I did essentially for 45 years.
Wow. You mentioned a moment ago you started in a B car.
Yes.
Explain, what's a B car? What was a B car back then?
Okay. Back in the 1800s, when all this was going on, there were, generally speaking, two classes in the Saturday night stock car tracks. One would have been the A class and one the B class. The A class at the time were coupes with souped-up flatheads in them. And the B cars, curiously, at Westboro at the time, were the first A-framed division in New England. And you could have any car from 1949 to 1953, and you had to have some semblance of roll bars, and that was it. Everything else was completely stock. And Kyle, I don't want you to think for the moment that this wasn't for the faint of heart, because they would start 33 cars every night, and they wouldn't allow you to lock the rear ends. They wouldn't allow you to do any spring work. So the center of gravity of these cars was so high, and flipping
I was going to say, that's why
was loudly promoted.
Gotcha.
And you got $100 to win and $25 to flip.
Wow.
And of course, the whole deal was to get both in one night,
Yeah.
which I managed to do 3 times.
So you flipped the first 3 times in the car? Is that?
Yeah.
And that didn't really
Pay the bills.
phase you? Paid the bills, I guess. Didn't even phase you as a driver? Or were you just that committed to driving?
There were some that would say it phased me deeply, but I kept going.
And so kind of tell us about what the scene was in the pits, and like what was it like at the tracks of that era. And you're a young guy trying just to be a driver. You're invested in this, in being involved in this sport. What was it like?
Well, it was a high noon anthropological experience for me. I'd never seen anything quite like the pits before.
And the son of a doctor in the pits of a speedway.
Yeah, I'm afraid so. But I was really into it and mowing 1 million lawns to keep this thing going. But over time, I really, began to adapt, but I did make some mistakes. For example, the first really good car I drove was for a guy that told me he was a bank robber, and I didn't believe him. And it was quite remarkable. This is a little off color, but here goes. We had kind of a ritual, and before the feature every night, he would help me buckle in, and then he would turn around and throw up. Just to give me a little bit of confidence before going out. But we did end up winning a lot, and it was good fun. But the pits were pretty wild back then, Paul, and there was both at Fonda and at Westboro an expression that it was really the thing to do not to fight too much in the pits. The two competing factions usually went so-called out to the Cow Palace and took care of it among themselves. It was pretty rough stuff.
Pretty rough.
Yeah.
It's hard for us to picture it now, kind of growing up at Stafford in the 90s and the early 2000s, where, I mean, what's a wild time in my mind is probably dramatically different from a wild time in the pits then, with the fighting and the just the kind of the crudeness of the cars and the teams. All, nowadays everyone's so polished, even at Stafford and the local tracks. It's just so different.
Yeah, it really is different. Everything was different, and there was a lot more color to it in a way, but a lot more darkness to it in another way.
Sure.
And another slightly off-color topic would be that one day Bill Welch called me several years later, and we always talked on Monday morning, and he was running Westboro at the time, and he pointed out to me with some surprise that they had sold 4 beers for every adult attendee. And when you
promoter likes that.
consider that some people don't drink, and that quite possibly all the adult tickets weren't counted, that's pretty big number.
So the pits were crazy, but it sounds like the stands were probably pretty crazy too.
Yeah. Later on, a friend of mine at Fonda, Dave Lape, told me that the purpose of the catch fence is to separate the fans from the drivers, and I think he's got a point.
Absolutely.
It's amazing.
So, what's your first exposure to Stafford Speedway?
My first exposure was hearing that it was a dirt track just over the line in Connecticut. We were near Boston at the time, living, and that some guys from Fonda were coming down there to race. So I started going down there, and by coincidence, when I got to know Dick and Bruce Cohen, who all 3 of us collaborated in Sizzler, we got talking about those old days and reminiscing about days that all 3 of us had been there, such as the night that Gene Bergen had that terrible crash in Sharkey's car and things like that, and watching the ultimate professionalism of Bill Wimble as he drove around that track. But it was really exciting. It was not what I would call Stafford today, being the shining city of modified racing, but it was really cool. And as a dirt track, it was pretty funky racing and good stuff, watching those New York guys take on the locals. Not big crowds, but enthusiastic crowds, and a wonderful announcer who kept saying, "Nothing ever happens at Stafford."
And who is that?
Oh, I don't recall.
Wasn't Ben Dodge, was it?
No.
So you first came to Stafford as a fan, a spectator, and then eventually you did compete there a few times, right?
Yeah.
Kind of tell us about a lap at Stafford in that era on the dirt. I mean, a lot of our listeners attended events then, but a lot of other ones were way younger who can't even picture Stafford.
Yeah, well, I would have you save that question for Berkey.
I will,
because
he
had quite a few laps there on the dirt.
On the dirt.
Yeah. I will say, though, that both of us had some further laps, because it was maybe a week or 2 after the first Spring Sizzler that we were both racing at Fonda, and it rained out. And so we came to Stafford, and Stafford was running on our way home. So dirt tires and all, out we went out there. Oh, and did Eddie Flimke ever give us a hard time?
So before we jump to the Sizzler, I want to talk some more about your driving. What tracks did you compete at? Kind of what kind of cars did you drive? And that eventually led you to being involved in the Sizzler, and we can get there.
Well, it all started at a really pre-Neanderthal track way up in Maine called Cherry Field, a little dirt track, and I ran up there in my first races, and then got some semblance of a B car together and started out there with that at Hudson Speedway. And these were mostly 49 Fords. And what you would do is just put one hoop behind the driver, often no braces at all, no side braces, nothing, just a seat. And the seat typically you'd weld a car wheel onto the frame and then weld the seat onto the car wheel, and just one belt. No shoulder harnesses, nothing. And so I ran those at Hudson and then Westboro for a number of years. Ran it at a little track up in New Hampshire called Brookline Speedway as well, and a few times at Thompson a little bit later when they had that Tiger division that was starting out. But my heart was really in the modifieds and open wheel stuff, and I wanted to get, because of my experience as a kid, to Fonda. So eventually I bought a little hobby car from Norwood, a 37 Chevy with a straight rear and a little small block in it. And I went to Lebanon Valley. And I don't want you to think my eyes were oversized, but my first race was the Lebanon Valley 200. And there were 100 cars there, and I remember starting next to Dutch Hogue, who was in Bill Wimble's sedan, which had this enormous injected Pontiac in it. And I was there with this little 301 popcorn machine, and it was really intimidating. And I raced at Lebanon for a whole year, crashing mightily many times and not qualifying once. But the next year began to get the hang of it and eventually went to Fonda and raced there up till the mid-70s, after which I realized that probably I was not going to become the next Richie Evans, and that I was pretty serious about the businesses that I was running. So I came back here and got some rides in asphalt modifieds, and then some late models at Hudson, and then continued dirt tracking when dirt tracking here became more popular up in the northern part of New England. And I continued well into the 2000s.
Wow. Long career.
Absolutely. Yeah, a very long career.
But not without its moments. My car number was always 181, which turned out to be a good thing because I flipped 17 different times.
And you got paid for several of those.
Early on,
Yeah,
I
early
did.
on.
Later on, they cost me a lot.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Was there a favorite car along the way that you drove?
I did have a favorite one, and Dick Bergman will smile when he hears this, because we actually had a number of cars that we drove together, and there was one, a sedan, that I think both of us liked quite a bit. But my all-time favorite of all thing was when I was running Lakeville, a dirt track down near Rhode Island, with wide open competition. And there'd be Holman, ex-Holman and Moody cars there, modifieds, junk cars, anything. And I demolished my car and was looking for something to drive, and I bought an old Hudson cut-down for $400 and put my modified motor in it and went to race against these huge things. And that little bug, oh, I loved that thing. And that was my all-time favorite car. But the sedan that I talk about is still in my garage today, along with my most recent car, which was my winningest car. And to be perfectly honest with you, sometimes in the middle of the night I go sit in them and make motor noises.
Just like any driver, just like any driver would.
Let's jump ahead to, 1970, 1971, when you put the promoter's hat on. How does this trio come to be that ultimately promotes the first Spring Sizzler at Stafford?
Well, there was a place in Needham, Massachusetts called Gasoline Alley, and a whole bunch of guys, Melnick and Lew Austin and Pete Hamilton, a lot of guys who ran Stafford, kept their housed their cars there in a little garage area owned by another racer named Jack Malone. And all the racing community would go over to a coffee shop there and sort of congregate and tell tall tales. And three of the frequenters there were Bruce Cohen, Dick Bergman, and Lew Boyd. Mm-hmm. And all of us being a half bubble off center, we got together and became racing teammates. And Bergie had a car, I had a car, and Bruce had money and a very big mouth, and we all got together and formed in honor of Bruce something called the Jewish Lightning Racing Team. And we raced, that was when we getting modifieds and beginning to get into more expensive racing. And we'd done that for a couple of years, but it was time to buy some big blocks, and we were out of money. And I know that Howie Commander takes credit for the inception of the Sizzler idea being in his basement, but I will have to disappoint him and tell him the truth is it came in a bar room in Cambridge called Cronin's. And we sat there maybe around Thanksgiving and talked about how can we possibly raise some money. And we got talking about races, and then suddenly we realized, everybody has these great big races in the fall, but nobody has one in the spring. And something, that Val LeSueur with that new paper, what's he going to write about all winter? And we began thinking about it more and more, and then the name of a race, the idea of a race came up, and we thought, wow, that could really be something. And given how big our eyes were, you heard about what I did going to the Lebanon 200 with a hobby car from Norwood. We said, well, we'll promote it. And so we gave it a try and had all winter to work on it, and it worked.
Is the bar room still there?
I don't know.
We'll have to find out.
I was going to say, that's a piece of Stafford history.
Yeah.
Bar room in Massachusetts.
What was it called?
It was called Cronin's, but
I'll have to look.
It's probably not terribly important that it was there because we went to a lot of bars.
Yeah, oh well.
So at this time where, so you're both driving, are you, have you done any other business type things before, or is this all of a sudden like, we'll try being promoters of an event?
Well, none of us had ever done anything quite like this before. Bruce was, I would say, the most settled of the three of us, and he had just finished up a brief career working at IBM, having graduated from BU, and of all things had taken over his father's rag business in Cambridge. So he was more stable. Bergie and I recently married at the time, and couldn't really think of a lot other than our wives and our race cars. We're a little bit less settled. Bergie was two-timing already. He was just had joined Stock Car Magazine and was a writer, I think, Northeastern editor or something like that at the time, about, of course, to take over the whole thing with great glory, but unsettled at the time. And the rest of his income, of all things, he had just graduated with a PhD from Tufts in psychology, and he was a teacher at an all-women's Catholic college in Boston, an unthinkable thing, and particularly engrossing was watching the nuns' faces when he'd come directly from the races on a Monday morning into the parking lot with his race car. But anyway, we really had no experience other than I had started a little art services business, but we really had done anything like this, and we realized that we'd need a lot of help. And that came in the form of one person. And if it could be said, Paul, that Bruce, Bergie, and I gave Stafford a gift with the Spring Sizzler, it was the second biggest gift we gave you. Because the first one was that we went to Bill Welch for help with the Sizzler. Every single night for the whole winter, we were in his basement, and he was calming us down, making us think about systems, making us think about every aspect of the race. And he was such a gentleman, as you guys probably remember. He was your announcer for years and years. Mm-hmm. And he was the one who really made the race happen.
And Stafford's going through a bit of a transition at this point now. Mal Barlow had the track, was leasing it out, I believe at the time, to Jack Sr. So there was a lot going on at Stafford Speedway in this time period.
Yeah, there really was. And
not all for the good.
Yeah, I guess not. And but I'll tell you this, we hoped when the three of us went to see Jack that he'd listen to us. And we said we wanted to rent the track for a day, and he didn't even ask us what we were going to do. And he just gave us the price, which was $1,000. And I think he thought we were going to do a go-kart race or something like that. But it was something a lot more. But he was comfortable with us all the way. And Bill Slater was a tremendous help to us. And so it worked out. But boy, he trusted us. And I'm not sure why he did, except he was a very bright man, and we got to be good friends. And I'd go see him a lot in Bedford, New Hampshire later in his life, and I think he recognized the passion that we had.
Well, yeah, he must have, because he was kind of always in the same boat of, he was in construction. Yeah. And he decided to purchase a speedway. It wasn't like that was all they did.
Yeah.
He owned cars for his whole life. That's and I know he was probably the most passionate the most passionate guy I've ever interacted with the modifieds.
Yeah.
Love the modifieds.
I know.
He would always say, he had a good at saying, you never want to be a driver. You want to be a car owner. I never really understood why, but until I got behind the seat, I guess because you're less addicted probably to the as a car owner, as a driver, but that's always a funny saying. Yeah. But I have to ask, was Stafford always the place the Sizzler was going? Or was there other tracks you looked at before, or was it had to be there?
Well, we did talk to Don Honig at Thompson, but he didn't exactly have Jack's sense of humor. Great guy, but he didn't have Jack's.
Interesting. So did you know prior to, did you just kind of call Stafford up and say, hey, we want to rent the track. That's what we want to do. Is that how it went down, or
what else could we do?
I guess, yeah. Did you know Bill Slater at the time, or did you know anybody who was there?
Yeah, Bergie particularly knew Bill Slater and was a big fan of his, and Bruce was too, because Bruce was Mr. Norwood Arena. And Slater, of course, was very big there. So I think Bill helped us a lot in the decision process probably, and certainly helped us along the way. But the day after the Sizzler, he made us pay up. He made us clean out the ladies' room. He did. He saved it for us.
So we'll talk more about the day after the Sizzler in a moment. I want to know about, all right, he says $1,000, it's yours. What's next as you prepare for that, I guess the second weekend of April at the time?
What was next? We said, oh, shit.
Yeah, because I'm thinking about this, right? I do this every day. It's all I've ever known. But if I was just to go into this never putting on a race, never knowing how a venue works, I would kind of be, how do I even start?
Go to Welch's basement.
So he was key in it.
Yeah, he really was.
Yeah.
And, I don't mean this unkindly. I don't think that Welchie himself ever would have done this, but he was the guy to come to once that you had it on the plate.
Mm-hmm.
What made him the guy? You've mentioned him several times now, and we know him as the announcer, but it sounds like he was a heck of a lot more than just an announcer.
He was the dean of auto racing in New England. One of the first inductees, first session of the Near Hall of Fame. Mm-hmm. He was involved in racing since pre-war, got involved with the Bay State Midget Association afterwards as an official. He was a scorer, an announcer. He was a car owner, a brilliant builder of Offie motors and flatheads, and the kind of person that you just could not help but liking. And he had a smile like a lighthouse by the sea, and everything that he did was completely moral and completely focused on people's benefit. And you just a great guy.
So what I'm really would love to understand and kind of get your, the stories on is nowadays, right? When we go to promote an event, sell tickets, it's online.
Yep.
Everything's online. Our marketing's online. The tickets sales are online. The car numbers come in online. How does a group of guys who've never promoted an event in 1972, how did you get the word out? How did you sell the tickets? How did you get the drivers to commit?
Well, I'm sure that Bergie will dig into this a lot more than I, but this whole event was much more an event of perspiration rather than inspiration at the end of the day. And first, to the fans, we really took advantage of Al Lesueur's problem and all the other newspapers, and there were a lot of them at the time, racing papers, and we just peppered them with press releases and ads every single week. And we tried to make them clever. Dick was particularly clever about this, coming up with the Spring Sizzler, the biggest race in the history of spring, and things like that. And every week we'd talk about more entries, and when it got to over 100, it was really a pretty impressive ad, just 100 names on it. And so, we talked to any media people, radio, anything we could do. As far as another thing that we did, and I found a couple that I will send to you, we came up with a poster, an orange poster about the Sizzler, and that we sent everywhere. And we went to every single garage that we could think of and told people about the race and how were they doing, would they like to come, and as part of that, we went to every single speed shop, every part supplier, and told them about it and got, gifts for the racers from them. And all the while, everywhere taking these posters, and they ended up everywhere in New England. It was unbelievable, actually. And with the ads and with everything, we would give the address 32 Linnean Street in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Today, I brought up a huge box to live here in the museum forever, and it is full of thousands and thousands and thousands of ticket stubs from the original Sizzler. Every single one of them went through 32 Linnean Street, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and we'd mail them the tickets, mail them a couple of posters, and the whole thing just began to build.
And you mentioned that there really wasn't a spring event at any tracks in the area. So when did the season typically begin in the region? Was it closer to May?
Yeah, it was typically the last weekend in April. But You mentioned before we got going, Paul, that for the Sizzler you had notified NASCAR that you were going to have it on such and such a date. And we did the same thing. And we really wanted this to be for the good of racing in general. We were making a statement. And we notified every single promoter in the Northeast that we were going to do it. And I think a couple of people ran against us, but nothing big.
Interesting that 50 years down the road that the way things change, they all stay the same, right?
Exactly. So true. It's exactly what I thought of.
You mentioned those ticket stubs. A great turnout, but there was a couple of hold-your-breath moments going into the weekend. I know Mother Nature wasn't the kindest, I guess, with her forecast going into that weekend. Is that correct?
My wife and I got there on race day at 5 in the morning. And we drove down from the center of town and along the backstretch and around to the pit area. And it was all rainy and foggy. And looking into the pit area, all I could see was color going off into the mist. And it was all those cars. Don Diffendorf, Dougal, the guy Olson, huge names as far as you could see. And it was an oh my God moment, but also an on the row shit moment. If this thing ever rains out, we're in trouble. And the rain was coming, and it threatened the whole time. And, we had 128 cars. We had 4 heats to run, a couple of consies, and an 80-lap feature, and we had to get it off fast. And wouldn't you know it, in the third heat, Roger Treichler peppers the wall in Sonny Cazella's log roller car and gets rushed off to the hospital. And screw up moment number 1. We only had 1 ambulance. So that was a long wait for that ambulance to get back. But it did. And come feature time, I was in the infield with your dad, Paul, with your grandfather, and I could remember watching Bergie. Bergie was wearing a little white Bill helmet cap, and you could see that cap just running up and down all around the grandstands. But anyway, the feature went off, and the weather was really, really getting bad at that point. And on the 39th lap, your grandfather was here, Jim Moffitt was here, both of them turned to me and said at the same time, now you quit being a promoter, go back to racing, and you'll die being a good promoter.
One and done.
And I said, good idea.
That halfway point is the hold your breath moment.
That's right.
At that point,
crowd.
whatever happens after that happens.
That lap.
So 128 cars in the pits. I can't even imagine the coordinating in that. The pits were much, much, much smaller then. For all the listeners to understand, the pits were probably a fifth of what they are now. How'd they even all fit in there?
How anything fit in anything that day, I don't know. The state police called us and said, you've got to go on the radio saying you're sold out. The traffic jam goes back to 84. This is ridiculous. Right. We turned away 2,000 people. A guy called yesterday and ordered a book and said, you heard about the Sizzler next year? I was at the original one and you guys wouldn't even let me in. And I stood on the road on top of somebody's car and watched. It was great.
Wow.
I think
awesome.
A lot of people did that. But one of the unpleasantries was we had to turn away people who'd come from Canada.
Wow.
It was, but it was a lot of luck, and that whole thing could never happen again, because it was just that we lucked out. It was just the perfect time to do something like that.
And I think one thing you've told me in the past was kind of the time frame with the cars, where you were able to pull dirt and asphalt cars kind of together at the same time. Is that the case?
And late models as well.
So it was
we
just
had
kind of a
A-frame
perfect
cars
storm of cars.
Oh, it was fabulous. Just everything.
And kind of explain to us then, so it was just before dirt cars kind of became their own thing and asphalt. It was just that time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really was. And some of them paid attention. Corky Cookman was a dirt tracker, and he lived in Green Farms, Connecticut. And I stayed with him a lot when I was going around seeing garages and stuff, and I persuaded him to come. Guess what? He never left.
He became pretty good at Stafford.
Yeah, good.
Never got a Sizzler. He got very close.
Yeah, great guy.
Yeah.
Did the success of that day, you said a lot of luck went into that first day.
Yeah.
Did it surprise you that you're sitting there turning away 2,000 plus people?
I don't know if surprise is the right word. I just said blown away by the whole thing. It was really something. Driving away, we all went to dinner down near Hartford that night, I think, and I think all of us in the core group realized that something really significant had happened, and we needed to process it for a while.
I was going to ask what post-race was like. There that next day like, other than cleaning the women's restroom?
Yeah. Oh, it was really something. There were a lot of things. One thing I should tell you about. We did have the purse covered with advanced sales, and we'd given a discount for advanced sales because we had no money, and if there were no advanced sales, we probably would have canceled.
That's a good feeling to go in. You at least have the purse
covered.
At least
have it covered. So, $13,475 was a lot for us in those days. So, Bruce was in charge of the money. So he slept in the office with a gun. And in the middle of the night, Jackie came in. And uh-oh.
I want to say it. Did Jackie tell us this story?
Yeah. But the next day was, I think, just the beginning of our processing. And it took a long time. Of course, we just hugged Bill Slater. He was so wonderful. But he was ready for us. We walked into the office, and he gave all three of us a mop and said, "Go to work."
The post race is out. I mean, the following day, you just can, when you have a big crowd, you can kind of bask in the glory of that and just pick the garbage up. Yeah, that's all you got to do.
What a mess. Oh, Jesus.
So talk to us a little bit about the race, if you really even had a chance to watch it that day. I don't know. You might have been stressed. It might be lap 39 on, but what was the racing like? Stafford in that era was very different than it is now, but it still kind of is the same with the style of, it's hard to pass, the bottom shot, which is our podcast namesake. Bugsy loves to talk about the bottom shot. Talk to us about the race that day. There was some great drivers in the field.
Yeah, there really were. There were 4 heats and consies, and the racing was actually very spirited, obviously, but there was also a lot of passing. And there was a lot of passing because certainly more than now, there was a huge differential in speed among the cars, and in a way that made it more exciting. Yep. And it was curious to see who won the heats. The first heat was another gift to Stafford, and that was literally a kid, an unpolished, unheralded, but extremely talented young man from Maine named Bobby Turner. And somehow he built beautiful stuff even back then, and somehow he managed to win the heat. And curiously about him, the first heat, curiously about him, we gave everybody some sort of gift or some sort of award. And because he won the first heat, he got the pole award. And the pole award was a telephone pole. And I believe it's still at Stafford.
Yes, I don't think he ever picked it up.
And I think the last time I talked to him, I pointed out that he still hadn't picked it up.
Yeah.
And great young man, and became a great competitor at Stafford. The second heat was won by a dirt tracker. The guy for whom the Moody Mile at Syracuse was named. He was Moody. And so an outsider. And then Leo won the third, and predicting what was going to happen, Flemke won the fourth from the back. So that meant that the field, even up front, was mixed, meaning that it was going to be an interesting race. And off they went. Bobby backed off almost immediately, and there were a couple of incidents, one with Ronnie Bouchard crashing. And by that point, Flemke that was maybe around lap 20, and Flemke had worked his way to the front, and so was on the point for the restart. And one of our people things that I thought was very, very special is that we had a very well-known, authoritative, old-time starter named Earl Grant. And Flemke jumped the start on the restart, and Earl Grant wasn't having any. So they come around, Flemke does it again. And Earl Grant takes the flags, throws them down on the flag stand, walks to the edge of the flag stand, turns his back to the field, telling Flemke, no more. Next time Flemke behaved. Wow. It was one of the coolest demonstrations of authority I've ever seen. It was really neat, but something that probably very few people saw. But it was brilliant, just cool. And so the race went on, and it, of course, was a dogfight then between DeSaro and Flemke. And Flemke dropped out around lap 70. And at that point, Leo was coming on pretty strong, and Bugsy was coming on strong too. But they both faded. Bugsy had brake problems. I can't remember what it was with Flemke, but the second place car was Denny Giroux at the end of it. And at the end of it, there was something that was really quite emotional. And as it probably would have been more our style to have a seriously voluptuous trophy queen, but we decided not to. And we picked a girl from Georgetown, Massachusetts named Annie Flanders. And just the cutest young kid, maybe 12 or 13 at the time, who had congenital diabetes. And she was really, really ill. She became the trophy queen and gave Freddie the trophy, and then she went home, lost the first leg, and shortly afterwards learned she was going to lose her second. She stopped eating and died in a week.
Wow.
But that was probably the finest day in her life. And
wow.
It was really something that touched us all very, very deeply. And then then was the payoff, and that was a treat. Everybody got beer, way too much beer.
Where'd you do the payoff? Was it in the hall?
In the hall, and
the history of that hall. I say
we've
it every
heard
time.
a lot
I'm
of
in
stories.
Oh, it was brutal. It was brutal. And
did every driver get something, or was just only the guys?
Oh,
who made
everybody
the feature?
got something. Yeah.
So you had everybody up there.
But the best moment was when Lenny Bowler showed up, and Lenny, he was so Lenny. But I'll tell you, for this time, the only time I ever saw it, but his smile actually went to both sides of his face. He was so pleased. So it was some kind of day.
Was the feeling that this was an important event? Was that like the feeling around the pits and around the track that this is a monumental event that's never happened before? Or was it just like, because it ends up being 50 years later, one of the longest standing, if not the longest standing short track event in the country?
We certainly realized that it was something big, but we had no intention of doing anything more. And the day after the race, we did talk to your granddad, and we gave him $1,000 for the point fund and said the race is yours.
What's Jack's reaction the next day?
Well, I think he was pleased and probably relieved because we could have messed up big time.
Absolutely.
But, having said that, he was there along the way the whole time, and so was Jackie, so was Bill Slater, particularly Bill Slater.
So now there's this legacy of the Sizzler, 50 years. What do you make of that? It's been around for this long. It's gone through all these eras of the sport. The ups and downs, the modifieds. It's coming. It's just like any other sport or event.
Yeah.
But it's still here. It's still strong.
Yeah.
It's going to be the biggest payday in Sizzler history this year. $130,000 on the line. What do you make of the legacy?
Well, obviously it's thrilling to us that this is happening. Racing has changed so much over time. We were trying, though, to make a statement with the original Sizzler. It seemed like everything was going to time trials and to 200 laps, and there was a feeling that maybe the modified should be like cup racing or something like that. And we kind of favored the Saturday night approach, and which is why we wanted to have a race that would have no pit stops and would have heats. And no matter how big it is, it could be done in one day. So it wouldn't cost an enormous amount of money for fans and for racers. And it gives us, I think, great pleasure. And a lot of people are noticing what you're doing, that you're maybe bringing back that flavor a little bit and making this a Saturday night race, something that's for modifieds the way they are on Saturdays, as opposed to the way they are on tour.
Mm-hmm. That's the goal. The goal is to, at the end of the day, we're short trackers. We're not cup stars, right? It should be that way. It should be accessible.
Thank you.
That's the goal, and we really appreciate what you guys have, created 50 years ago. Actually, 51, because we had to take a year off, unfortunately, which gave us a little time to prepare again. But tell us about what you do now with your books and stuff, and tell the listeners where they can pick up some great copies of the Bowler book, the Bugsy book.
Yeah. Well, as I said, along the way, I did a lot of racing at Fonda, and there was a real tough old dirt tracker at Fonda named Kenny Shoemaker who came to the Sizzler. And he and I got a little crossed up a couple of times on the track at Fonda. And the last time that happened, he sent me home with one wheel left on my car. But after that, we got to be friends, and he helped calm me down a little bit with racing, as Bill Welch had done years before. And much later, he called up one day and said that he was dying and wanted to write a book about his career. And so I thought, well, that's something I could help him with, and maybe help him pay him back for some of his kindnesses. And we wrote the book, and it did really well. And I thought, well, might as well keep going. And that was, I think, 22 years ago. And now, with our own titles and others, we've got about 1,500 titles total, and all kinds of books about guys who are in the New England Hall of Fame. And it's not a huge thing, but it does save the history of racing, and it's really fun. We've got books on, as you said, on Bugsy, on Dave Dion, just so many guys, and the most recent one, Old Blue. And my car number was always 181, and when I'm not doing the book thing, I have a management consulting company called Coastal International, and so the book company is Coastal 181, Coastal 181 being on our website, and anybody's interested in racing material or getting a racing person out of your hair during winter, give us a call.
They're also available. A couple of the Stafford guys are available on StaffordSpeedway.com.
Thank you. Yeah.
There are some great books. I've read the Bowler one, the Bugsy one. They're excellent. Well, it's an hour. That was amazing.
It's amazing.
We
That was
really
a quick
enjoyed
hour.
that. I like to say we at Stafford all appreciate what you three did 50 years ago, and we hope we continue on the Sizzler legacy far into the future.
Well, I don't think we appreciate you or anything like that, Paul. Thank you so much. This is such a treat, and as I said, it's just a thrill for us to feel a re-up of what we were doing.
Well, we'll give you one additional thrill and announcement. We'd love to have you and Dick as the grand marshals at the 50th. If you both are available, and if Bruce is available too, we would love to.
Yeah.
And only if it feels right, and it's yours if you want it.
Gosh, I'll have to get a start shirt.
That's right. Thank you for joining us, Lew.
Thank you, guys.
Appreciate it.